Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. India was the only country in the eight-nation Shanghai Cooperation Organisation on Sunday which refused to endorse China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, for which Beijing has signed pacts with nearly 80 countries and international organizations. A declaration issued at the end of the two-day summit of the SCO said Russia, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have reaffirmed their support for the Belt and Road Initiative of China. In his address at the summit, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in an oblique reference to the BRI, said that any mega connectivity project must respect sovereignty and territorial integrity of the countries and assured India's full support to initiatives which ensure inclusivity. Despite disagreements between members of the eight-member grouping, the apparent harmony in which the summit took place stood in contrast with the G7 meeting in Canada. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze the 2018 SCO Summit. Joining me on the program today are TCA Rangachari, former ambassador, Professor Harshvi Pant, Head Strategic Studies Observer Research Foundation, and Major General Dhruv C. Katoch, Director, India Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador, I'd like to start the program with you. What were the key takeaways for you from the SCO Summit 2018?
Well, I think at one level, perhaps as you said in your initial comment, the relative harmony in which the summit proceeded, although I'm a little hesitant to draw a contrast between the SCO summit and the G7, for reasons maybe if you have time we can come to a little later. The SCO summit essentially is cohesive, it's part of the region, and the issues that they are dealing with, and they dealt with in Qingdao also, are issues which are of particular concern insofar as this region is concerned. Of course, they also express their views in regard to several of the issues on a extra regional, if I may say so, and global level. But there, the problem is that not all of the SCO countries are quote-unquote players in each of those situations which the SCO summit talked about. For example, there were references made to North Korea. North Korea, maybe United States, China, Russia, they are involved in very closely. Rest of the SCO countries are not so. Similarly, there was a reference to Syria, where the European Union, the United States, Russia are involved. So those issues and those specific issues which affect the region, I think there was, as you said in your opening remarks, relative harmony. The conclusions, the declaration and the agreements that have been signed deal with topics which are of relevance to these countries. The one thing that we need to look at from India's point of view is that on some of the core issues which were supposed to be at the summit, for example, on the issue of terrorism, to what extent, or even, for example, peaceful borders and so on, to what extent are the declarations and the sentiments expressed at the summit going to be in any way translated into reality, and to what extent the summit and the member countries are going to use their influence, whatever extent is possible, in order to ensure that from taking place. If that happens, obviously the takeaways would be very positive. But I think, as experience would indicate, this is something that we have to wait and see to what extent, as a result of the declarations made in Qingdao, we are going to see actual impact on the ground.
Right. General, what are the takeaways really for India from the SCO summit?
You know, I was actually looking at it from the security angle, and I think what we find very interesting as far as what took place in Qingdao in this 18th SCO was how India has positioned itself. Now, when I was looking at the, when you're looking at the relationship of India per se, what are India's key strategic or grand strategic concerns? Basically, it is two. One is, when we're looking at South Asia, what India is looking at is to be the preeminent player in South Asia and also in the Indian Ocean region. And the second aspect is, it is to maintain its strategic autonomy. Now, if this has been our core concern, then I think what has happened at SCO has been, to an extent, from the Indian point of view, a replay of what India's security interests are and how they can be maintained. Now here when we are looking at it, we are looking at four big players. We are looking at India's relations with the United States, which obviously wasn't part of the SCO, but we are also looking at India's relations with Russia and with China. Now, when we are looking at this particular relationship and we are looking at SCO, SCO initially was really a security agreement between three of the Central Asian republics, China and Russia. And the aim was to curb terrorism per se in the Central Asian region. Now it has grown. There are 8 members and India and Pakistan happen to be included. So when we're looking at the Indian impact on it, India has got concerns as far as China is there. And when we are looking at our concerns with China, let us say military concerns, then the United States becomes a good hedging ground, right? So we can balance off our relationship with China using support from the United States. Secondly, we've also got a very strong defense agreement with Russia, and again we can play off our relationship with Russia as a balance against China. So it is really treading a very fine walk. We've got good relations with China too, which have been reset post the recent unofficial meetings between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. But the point is that it has been a very delicate balancing act, and to put it very simply, the CATSA, which has been, the security agreement of the United States, where they have placed a certain ban on Russia, puts India in a situation by which certain of our defense deals with Russia, like the Triumph, are actually getting obstructed.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if India is going to go ahead with it, in which case the Americans may not give us the Predators. Now, it is an interesting thing, because if the Americans don't give us the Predators, it will weaken our stance with China, which will actually force the Americans really to give it. So it is, when we are looking at what has happened in Qingdao, I think the cards have been played reasonably well.
Right.
And from the security point of view, I just wanted to give a slightly different perspective to what the ambassador gave. But I think it has been played reasonably well. And this game will continue to go on for quite some time. And we'll see as to how it actually plays out.
Indeed, the game is going to continue for some time. Having said that, Professor, was the SCO summit, a platform to bring about some kind of peace between India and Pakistan? There are several differences amongst these countries within the region itself, but yet the summit seemed to be very harmonious and peaceful.
Yes, I don't know whether it has the capacity or the inclination to play the kind of role that perhaps many would want between India and Pakistan. But I think the larger reality that what we are witnessing now is this rise of Eurasia. And that that geographical or geopolitical landscape, which at one point was not part of the mainstream discussions, is now back in vogue. So when you are comparing, when you are comparing what happened in G7 to what was happening in SCO, I think it also reflects two different dynamics being played out in two different parts of the world. West is struggling with some of its contradictions. Eurasian leadership is also now making a comeback. So you have the Russians and the Chinese who are now looking at Eurasia as this major area from which perhaps power can be projected in the future. So I think with that, if you are looking at it from that perspective, India's role, which traditionally has been relatively limited in Central Asia, becomes one of the areas where India can also now project its power using some amount of SCO's heft. So I think what by and large seems to be happening is that the engagement that India has had with the Russians and the Chinese more recently, the sort of unofficial engagements, have allowed India now to look at SCO in a slightly different light, and perhaps taking this forward if the concerns about terrorism, as I think the highlight of the declaration was terrorism, separatism and extremism, and how these countries, how this region can combat that problem. I think if that is something that India can take away from this platform and make it imperative on other regional countries, especially Pakistan, I think that would be a significant takeaway. But that would again depend on how these things are operationalized. We have seen a few false dawns in the past, and hopefully that will not be the case this time, when we are looking at some very significant bilateral engagement with key players like China and Russia. So if you look at the kind of arguments that the Russians and Chinese are making about the role of terrorism in regional landscape, from their own perspectives, it's very important. I think from India's perspective, it also becomes very important that India continues to have a foothold in a very important, strategically very important part of the world, as well as using that dynamic to use the platform's influence for curbing terrorism.
Would you see terrorism as a binding force then between these countries?
To a certain extent, yes. You see, we have had some success in BRICS summit as well, where we were after initially not having that bigger success in the Delhi, in the Goa summit, BRICS summit, and then later on last year's summit was a success because India could bring to bear it on Russians and the Chinese. That terrorism is a major problem, and certain actors will have to be needed to be identified. So the last year's BRICS declaration did identify that very categorically, and that was seen as a success for Indian diplomacy. Now, whether or not SCO becomes one of those platforms, again, remains an open question, because I think if you read the declaration carefully, groups were not mentioned.
Yeah.
So there was, there are oblique references here and there, but nothing of, nothing, specific comes out of the declaration, and that is to be expected given the sort of platform that it is. And from their perspective, from SCO's perspective, Pakistan is not the only actor.
Yes.
So therefore you would not expect them to name or shame Pakistan, because Pakistan is seen as a country that is also a part of the larger Eurasian landscape as far as SCO is concerned. So I think going forward that would be a challenge. How can you convince not only Russians and the Chinese but also other members of SCO that India's concerns regarding Pakistan remain very valid and will have to be taken seriously?
You know, Ambassador, while the SCO summit was going on in China, there was another interesting summit that took place, on the other side of the world, the G7 summit in Canada. How would you look at both these summits?
I think the two are completely different organizations. At one level, as far as the G7 is concerned, this is a grouping of the top economies of the world.
But yet they don't seem to be on the same page.
Well, yes and no, because you see, one is the question of economic integration, and the other is the question of defense alliance and so on. So far as the G7 defense alliance is concerned, even despite some of the statements that were initially made by President Trump, the fact is that they are part of the transatlantic alliance. They are part of a military structure where there is a treaty, NATO, and then there is an organization. There is also a structure in place in terms of a supreme allied commander, etc. So that is one. SCO doesn't have anything comparable, and not even insofar as the statements, official declarations and statements are concerned, SCO is not even saying that they are going to proceed in that direction of creating any kind of a military structure or military alliance. Secondly, if you look at the economic strength, today China is the second largest economy, and as the second largest economy, it is bigger than Japan, Germany, France, Britain combined. But if you leave China aside, we are at a stage where we have just about overtaken Britain. Possibly we will overtake France in the course of this year or perhaps sometime next year. We still have to get ahead of Germany, we still have to get ahead of Japan, which may happen next 3 to 5 years. So in terms of sheer economic power, in terms of the capital, in terms of markets, in terms of technology, G7 is a very different kind of grouping. In a sense, it is a group of rich countries fighting over market access in each other's economies. And this is a problem which they will resolve on their terms. And to my mind, these are problems which are unlikely to be long term, because the Americans also would see advantage, despite what President Trump has been saying, with the tariffs, etc. and so on, not to disrupt the global economic system of which the European Union and the United States, the G7, is such an integral part. So I think in that sense, the G7 group is very different. There can be differences of opinion within the G7 as to whether Russia should be called back in or not, whether the suspension should continue. If Russia goes, then questions should be asked that are they going to look upon G7 as more important or SCO as more important? That's also a question that can arise in the future. SCO is not that type of an organization. And I think we have a long way to go. Again, despite China and China's economic size, we have a long way to go before we can become the kind of club that G7 is.
Sure.
I don't even know whether SCO aspires to become that kind of a club.
Indeed. That having been said, General, are we witnessing a realignment from a geopolitical point of view?
No, I really don't think so. And I'll tell you why. What Ambassador Rangachari said is absolutely correct. When you're looking at the security architecture and when you look at the SCO, you are finding three major countries there, India, Russia, and China. I don't see them getting together into a security relationship on the lines of NATO. It is not going to happen, right? but when you look at the 8 countries per se, you look at the India-Pakistan relationship. Now, there is no way in which you can get into a security apparatus with Pakistan. There is no way in which India is going to get into that sort of relationship with China, or China is going to get through with Russia. So I think we are looking at a totally different ball game. When SCO was initially created as a security apparatus, it was a security apparatus, but then it was targeted specifically against terrorism in the Central Asian republics. That was the concern. How do we stop terrorism from the Central Asian republics spreading into other areas? So with that as a central point of concern, you know, this when the first conference took place, that was the start point. Now, of course, there is a very major thrust towards economics also. So we are having China, which is pushing the economic agenda, and Russia, which is still pushing the security agenda. I think within a year or two, Russia may well be part of the G8 now. You know, they have been taken off temporarily post Crimea. But so if Russia is going to be part of G8 and Russia is going to be part of SCO, you know, I don't think there is any compatibility per se as far as the security alignment is concerned. But I think SCO still has got a very important role to play as far as the aspect of terrorism is concerned. It is still the most important threat to world peace today. And I think one of the things which has come out in my understanding of it when I read the declaration is the overall thrust that it should be an international body which should really formulate policies. That means they are looking at the United Nations, right? United Nations, the task force, there are already, I think, 17 task forces as part of the UN. They are looking at the world body and organization at that level to pursue it, rather than a unilateral declaration by either the United States or anybody else. I think that is a very important thing which is actually coming out. And I think if that comes about, India will be in support of it. India has always supported the fact that any action to be taken on the terrorism front should be done under the aegis or under the flag of the United Nations, and then India will be very happy to cooperate. But if it is under the flag of any individual country, or even if it is NATO, or whichever way you do it, the way it is in Afghanistan or Iraq, I don't think India is ever likely to jump into that particular fray. So to that extent, I think there is a difference between what is happening in NATO. NATO is a very well-oiled machine. It is a proper military machine, I can call it.
Sure.
Right? And I don't think SCO is anywhere near that, and it is not going to, it doesn't aspire to be there, nor will it reach there.
Right. You know, that having been said, Professor, what role do you see the SCO playing in the near future?
I think I would think that any platform which has 3 major countries like India, China and Russia will inevitably play an important role. Now, the fact of the matter is that India, China and Russia engage with each other at multiple levels. You have the Russia, India, China trilateral, you also have BRICS, and you also have several other platforms. Now, SCO becoming increasingly with India's entry, this was the first year that India participated as a member state. I think we are witnessing that somehow Central Asia becomes an area which will dominate the discussions insofar as SCO is concerned, because this has been one area, as I think was earlier articulated, that was seen as very crucial in the fight against terrorism. And increasingly the sense was that if terrorism had to be managed, it had to be contained in Central Asia, and Central Asian countries needed to be helped in capacity building, in terms of looking at the future. How do you manage, how do you how do you control the expansiveness of terrorism? And so I think India, which has had you know, an interest in expanding its presence in Central Asia, perhaps gains a foothold in the region via SCO. And increasingly, if you look at what Mr. Modi said, what the Prime Minister of India said in the SCO, he also talked a lot about connectivity. He talked about economic integration. So I think that is something that India is looking forward to the larger Eurasian landmass. How can we connect better with a very important part of the world, which is going to be very important if you are looking for the long-term economic regeneration of global economy. So I think SCO as a platform becomes very crucial for India, if you are looking at primarily from an Indian perspective, in terms of engaging the region, in terms of increasing connectivity and economic cooperation. Multilaterally, it becomes important if you are looking at trying to manage terrorism and extremism in a very important part of the world. So
and especially at a time when the West is looking more inwards, and when China and India are talking about globalization, it seems like, you know, the times have changed completely.
That, I think, is a very interesting debate, at least temporarily, that we are witnessing, where American retrenchment is becoming the larger frame, and China's expansive, sort of more progressive ideas about how do you manage the global economy is becoming another frame. So I think with Mr. Trump, who's very unpredictable, it becomes very difficult to negotiate some of these changes in the short term. But I think long term, West will see the advantages of globalization, as I think almost all the other economies in the West have been constantly arguing about. But I think in the short term, this becomes a very, very important signal that globalization can only be sustained if you have countries like China and India making a very, very strong case about globalization.
Sure. Talking about the BRI now, Ambassador, India has refused to endorse China's BRI at the SCO. On expected lines, of course, because that is something that India has time and again said. But is China going to be miffed at that?
Before we come to the Belt and Road Initiative, two quick points. One, despite all this talk about protectionism, etc., the Western markets are still more open than, for example, the Chinese market is, and we know that from our own experience. We don't have time, so I won't go into details. But this is something that, just because you say that you are pro-globalization, you want to fight against protectionism, doesn't necessarily make your policies commensurate with what you are saying. That is one. Secondly, insofar as terrorism in Central Asia is concerned, our problem is not with Central Asia as far as terrorism is concerned.
Our problem is with
Pakistan. Our problem is elsewhere. Now, what we have to see is whether the SCO is in a position to exert any influence in the direction in which the source of terrorism comes as far as India is concerned. Now, insofar as the One Belt, One Road is concerned, I am using that term in contrast to BRI, because BRI is a term which is used in English only. In Chinese, it is still called One Belt, One Road. So, as far as the One Belt, One Road is concerned, I think our position is known. I don't think it would have come as a surprise to the Chinese. Maybe if you look at the formulation, it was not necessary to mention all the countries by name, but probably the Chinese also wanted to make a point that only one country is not supporting the Belt and Road Initiative. They are the hosts. And as far as India is concerned, since our position is known, I don't think we would have worried too much about standing alone in not endorsing what is being done under the rubric of One Belt, One Road. As far as One Belt, One Road is concerned, also we must take note that many of the projects which started well before this initiative was announced have also been brought under the rubric of One Belt, One Road. And then it has had some positive consequences, which is very good, because all countries need money for infrastructure development. And if the Chinese are in a position to provide that money, very good. But at the same time, there are also a large number of projects which are not economically viable, which are not economically sustainable. And some consequences, as we have seen in the case of Sri Lanka, in the case of Pakistan, what is happening in some of the projects in Laos, in Indonesia, and so on. I think it's legitimate for India to say the kind of things that we have said. That you first of all look at the priorities set by the recipient countries themselves, partner countries themselves. Secondly, you make sure that it is economically viable. And thirdly, you make sure that it is sustainable. And those are principles which I doubt that even the Chinese would object to. Whether they abide by it or not, that's a different matter.
Sure. General, what's the way ahead really for the SCO? Where do you see it headed?
No, I think it is going to expand further. But I think it will keep its, in my own personal view, I think it will keep its, the agenda will still remain limited. And it is going to be limited to, one is the counter-terrorism efforts, right? The security aspects within the region too. And three, I think it will be, when we are looking at international challenges like climate change, which are really neutral as far as the world is concerned. So I think they will be looking at much closer to that. They will also be looking at making things more multilateral rather than unilateral systems, which is more of a predominant norm today. Now, what the United States says actually goes, because they are in a position to implement what they want. But the rest of the world isn't. So there is no other country which can really go on a unilateral system on its own, except for the United States. So I think what the SCO will really be aiming to do is to have much more cooperation within the countries as far as conflict resolution is concerned, and economic cooperation is concerned. That is the way I look at it as of now.
Sure. Professor, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Well, I think SCO will, I agree, will look forward towards expanding its remit a bit more, especially if you're looking at Iran becoming a full member very soon. So I think that is an area where we have seen, for example, how Iran used this platform to engage with Russians and the Chinese about its Americans' rejection of the nuclear deal. So I think a lot of what seems to be happening is a response to what Mr. Trump is doing, and I think for India, therefore, it will continue to be a delicate balancing act. How far can we use this platform to serve our interests, while at the same time limiting our exposure to what might come from the West in response to what this platform does or does not do in the future.
All right, on that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'd like to hear from you as well. You can share your feedback and suggestions. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it from me. See you again next time.